So I've got my hands on this amazing little Canon RF 85mm f2 lens for a while, so today I'm going to be putting it to the test on a portrait shoot. This is just one of two 85mm prime lens options on the RF mount right now, so I'll also put it up against its much bigger and more expensive brother, the RF 85mm 1.2. And as part of that comparison, we'll look at things like sharpness and rendering, as well as much more. But first of all, let's get straight into the photo shoot. My camera setup for the shoot was the Canon R5, so its 45 megapixel sensor will certainly test this lens. I shot natural light portraits wide open throughout to get a feel for the lens's performance. And after seeing the first images, I was immediately impressed with the results from this lens. More than enough 3D pop, and the sharpness was apparent straight away. Perfect. I positioned Darcy here where I could capture the leading lines from the windows on the left, and the bokeh looks really nice and smooth here with great colours and contrast in the image. So this is where I had my first issue with autofocus with this lens. I like to include little bits of foreground interest in my portraits quite a lot, and those little fairly inobtrusive leaves to the right of the frame in these shots just seem to cause havoc with the autofocus on this lens. Come on, camera. It just seemed to want to front focus on those leaves rather than the model's eye, and I had to override the autofocus a few times in order to get the shot. I shoot this kind of composition all the time on a range of different RF mount lenses and never really have an issue, so it's hard to say whether it was the lens or just bad luck with the camera, but this was the only real issue I encountered in terms of autofocus with this lens. Sorry, the camera's really wanting to focus. Doing. Maybe stand like here, maybe like quite like amongst it there. Although I might mid this time. Yeah, these look really good. The light's perfect. Shooting these kinds of portraits at 85mm, I like to find little pockets of foreground detail to help me frame the subject wherever possible. So this gives a good opportunity to see how the lens renders out of focus areas in the foreground, which can be a weak point for some of Canon's cheaper lenses, but I see no issues on this 85mm f2. It's rendered really smoothly, no nervous or distracting bokeh. For a more close-up portrait, I wanted to create a natural border around Darcy using this foliage. Maybe like if you're like stood there, because I can frame you underneath with this, and then that comes above. Should be cool. Yeah, this is literally awesome. Cool. And I love how these images turned out. This lens just provides so much depth to quite a simple image. And taking a quick close look at sharpness in a shot like this shows very impressive results. Tons of detail in the eye, and we see that shallow depth of field provided by that nice f2 aperture. Perfect. Oh, the light's amazing. Nice. But we'll examine sharpness a little more later and put it up against that RF 85mm 1.2. In general, although far from a challenging situation, for portraits like this I found the autofocus to be reliable with little to no out of focus images. Yeah, it is probably one of RF mount's slowest and noisiest STM motor lenses, but autofocus didn't get in the way here at all. Maybe you can just stand like here, right in front of me and face me, and I'll get slightly wider. Yeah. Let's take one last look at bokeh. I placed Darcy in front of a colourful but very busy background to see how this fast aperture lens will render it. Cool. Amazing.
So these are real tight crop, like headshots basically.
And in general, it does an excellent job, especially at this crop. Yes, there are some hard lines around the flowers behind, but in terms of separation, at f2 it is effortless to make your subject pop from a busy background like this. And now taking a step back to a more mid-length crop shows the almost swirling characteristics of this lens's bokeh, which does look amazing. This lens excels at taming busy, distracting background and imparts a beautiful character onto the outer focus areas. So that's the shoot, and after looking at and editing the results, I have to say I am beyond impressed with this lens. I've owned the RF 85mm 1.2 for a long time now, and looking at the results from this lens without putting it side by side against this, I really didn't feel like I was missing that 1.2 aperture much at all, and kind of felt like image quality seemed comparable to what I've experienced with the 1.2 lens. But let's find out and put these two lenses side by side. So here is the 85mm 1.2 for a headshot, and it absolutely obliterates the background, as you can see. Here is the 85mm f2, which at this crop gives a very similar result in my opinion. Side by side, you can see the extra background blur you get with the 1.2 sure, but both look great to me. The extra separation you get from the 1.2 aperture gives that image a more painterly, dreamy look, whereas the 85mm f2 looks just a little more flat in comparison. If we zoom in, then sharpness is surprisingly comparable. Sure, the 85mm 1.2 is the slightest bit more crisp, for lack of a better word, but sharpness will not be an issue on either of these lenses. The RF 85mm 1.2 is the king of 3D pop when it comes to full-length portraits in my opinion. So let's see how this f2 version compares in this scenario. Here is the 85mm 1.2, and there's so much background separation here, Rachel almost looks like a cardboard cutout. The background is rendered so smoothly. Now here's the f2 version, which also looks really nice, but of course we are seeing that reduction in background separation. Side by side, it is crazy how much more bokeh you get at 1.2. And on the f2 image, you can see a branch to the right of the frame, which is completely obscured on the 1.2 lens thanks to that extra blur. Taking another close look, again, a slight advantage for the 1.2 lens wide open, but these lenses are close. Of course, by the time you've stepped down the RF 85mm 1.2 to f2, then it does pull ahead, but if you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars on this lens, then I think you probably did that to shoot it wide open. So after comparing them side by side, I am even more impressed with this f2 lens. But it doesn't stop there, and this lens is the gift that keeps on giving because it has one more trick up its sleeve, and that is macro functionality. Sure, it is not true macro, but let's take a look at the minimum focus distance on both the 1.2 and the f2 lenses to see exactly what this means. Here is an example on the RF 85mm 1.2 of the closest you can focus on this camera. Now let's see how much closer the 85mm f2 can focus. That is a whole lot closer and really useful for things like product photography. Here is another example of the RF 85mm 1.2 focusing as close as it can on this watch. And here is the RF 85mm f2. Look how sharp these macro shots are. This is really impressive performance. So in my opinion, the macro functionality on this lens makes it a really versatile option for somebody like a wedding photographer, for example, as it may mean you do not need to carry a dedicated macro lens anymore. Here's the 85mm 1.2 focused as close as it can on this ring. And now here is the 85mm f2. Amazing. So that macro functionality is no joke and makes this lens seriously attractive. Autofocus is not exactly great when shooting macro. It's very slow and very, very noisy, but to me that is a small price to pay for such a useful function. Now let's take a quick look at handling, where the RF 85mm f2 feels well built and at home on Canon's full frame RF mount cameras, where it balances really nicely. It features a mostly plastic build and has a 67mm front filter thread. The RF 85mm f2 has a few switches, one to limit the focus distance to help presumably in macro situations, one to toggle autofocus and one to toggle image stabilization. That's right, this lens also features lens image stabilization, which will help you get those steadier shots in both photo and video. Now here's a look at the RF 85mm 1.2 in comparison, just to show how much bigger this lens is. It's longer, it's wider, and much heavier, weighing in at 1,200 grams compared to the F2 version's modest 500 grams. That's more than twice the weight. I suffer a little bit from wrist pain, and I have found that the RF 85mm 1.2 is one of the more uncomfortable lenses to use on the RF mount because it is so front heavy. This is not a problem that you have on the RF 85mm f2 thanks to its smaller, lighter design, and the weight is distributed nice and evenly. So, final thoughts on this f2 lens. I was very impressed as it is sharp, it's lightweight, and it is well built, whilst still being relatively low cost, at least in the world of RF mount lenses anyway. At 85mm for portraits, I really believe that f2 is more than enough background separation for most people, and something like the RF 85mm 1.2 really is a specialty lens. Its 5 to 6 times higher price tag, in my opinion, is not worth it to 90% of people, but once you do own it and you see the results, it is hard to let it go. Even if you know in the back of your mind, like me, that you probably don't need this lens. I've uploaded a few raw files so you can check out the performance of the f2 lens for yourself, and there is a link in the description to download those. Anyway, that is my review, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.